Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode, before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Hannibal Season 1, Episode 7, Sorbet. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary of exactly what happens within this episode. Hannibal prepares for a dinner party. The team catch an organ harvester. Franklin is a stalker. Hannibal meets with his therapist, and Will misses a session with Hannibal, who finds him at the FBI, discovering that he is losing time. Now that I've rewatched the episode, we will now go into the rankings of this episode against the other episodes within the series. As a reminder, on this channel, we rank on two lists. The first is mostly objective, and then the second is personal. The mostly objective is based on chart values, which I have created the chart, so my bias and judgment do apply there. And then also the personal list, which is solely based on my opinion. So as always, we begin with our mostly objective rank values. I've highlighted those I felt applied. This time we're going to start on the negative side. So on the negative side, we basically only have one thing, which is that this episode had a pretty weak subplot. Not necessarily that it had to be weak, but that they just didn't spend a lot of time on it. They didn't really flesh out who the killer was. It didn't really have much value to it. It was basically a rogue medical student who happened to be an ambulance driver, a paramedic, who decided to take it upon himself to harvest organs from healthy individuals so he could sell them on the black market, seemingly to help those who are waiting for donors and need that. Honestly, it was mostly used to confuse whether or not the Ripper had a partner, to bring up the idea of whether or not the Ripper may be harvesting organs, rather than being a cannibal, in fact, was a organ harvester. But ultimately, they didn't put a lot of time into it. They didn't put a lot of effort into it. It was kind of a between scenes, just again, to kind of act as a method to bring up points about Hannibal and the Ripper. We even only saw the killer for like one scene, a few minutes in one scene, and even then Hannibal kind of stole the show for it. So overall, I found the subplot very weak, and that is why it's at a -2 points. Now, to the more positive sides of the episode. We had an introduction of a multi-episode supporting character, which is Franklin's friend Tobias Budge, who does recur in later episodes, but ultimately played a very small role in this episode. We see him once being introduced to Hannibal when he goes with Franklin to an opera that he's stalked Hannibal to, and then he's mentioned when Franklin then goes to a session with Hannibal later for therapy, but ultimately plays a pretty small role, and that is a positive too, which brings us up to a 0. Those have canceled each other out, the negative and that introduction. We then see a multi-season character introduction, which is Bedelia de Maurier, which is Hannibal's therapist. Again, in this particular episode, we just see a session between her and Hannibal. We get one of those iconic lines, which is another positive that is worth noting, is one of those memorable lines, one of those things that you see repeated over and over and over. Now, I know not everybody reads fan fiction. That's a pretty niche thing. I, however, happen to, and this line is one that kind of gets played with or people run with pretty frequently. And that is basically that she says that naturally she respects its meticulous construction, but tells Hannibal that he is wearing a very well-tailored person suit. And then later clarifies that if not a person suit, then it may be called a human veil. But the person suit is what people grab and run with. And that, of course, makes it iconic because you hear about it quite frequently if you do happen, like myself, to read a lot of fan fiction. So we, of course, have 3 for the character introduction, and then also +3 for the iconic line, which brings us to 6 so far. And then the other positive from this chart that we have is, of course, the multi-season main character development. And this we see with Hannibal, who we basically see outside of the confines of his role as a therapist or FBI consultant. We see him starting at an opera where he is listening to the opera, tears in his eyes. We then see him socializing with characters at that opera. He is also confronted with the fact that Franklin is stalking him when he shows up to the opera with Tobias Budge, which is where we met him. But we see that he has a social circle that's outside of the FBI characters. We also see this again with Bedelia, where we learn that he does in fact have his own therapist, and also again that's outside of the standard circle of characters we've seen him interact with so far. We also find out that he is known for very theatrical and impressive dinner parties, which we also see at the end of the episode when he basically has, with his murders from the episode, cooked a grand feast for a large table. And we see a scene where Will brings a bottle of wine but doesn't say for the party as he doesn't feel like he'll fit in, where Hannibal is even working with assistant chefs because it's that big of a to-do that he needs extra help in the kitchen. And then we see basically the table filled with people and they are all applauding him as we pan over all of his extravagant dishes. And then he gives a brief speech before the episode ends. And so that develops Hannibal's character, I think. We also get it kind of reiterated that he used to be a surgeon, especially when he saves the final victim of the organ harvester, also near the end of the episode. We also get some development of Will, and more specifically Will's illness, where we find that for the first time he's missed an appointment with Hannibal, and when Hannibal then goes to find him, we see him basically sitting rigid, staring off into space, eyes open, nobody home, losing time. And that's advancing that. So with all of these together, we have basically the negative and the Tobias canceled each other out. We have 6 from the 2 positives, and then the character development aspects is a +4. And that, of course, brings us to 10, making this objectively, or at least mostly objectively, a 10 out of 10 episode. So in this case, our objective score being 10 out of 10, when we have episodes that, on the mostly objective list at least, had the same ranking amount, like the same number, we just put them in episode order. So that puts Sorbet at slot 3. So in first place, we had Aperitif, second, Souffle, third is Sorbet, fourth place, Amuse-Bouche, fifth, Potage, sixth, Entree, and 7, Coquelle. And now we get into the personal ranking. To start, I'm just going to call out some of the things that stood out to me in the episode, which formed my opinion on why I ranked it where I did. So first off, this is the first time that we're hearing that the Ripper kills in sounders of 3. The reason that Will uses that language, he explains in the episode, is because that's a word for small groups of pigs, and he believes that is how the Ripper sees his victims, as pigs. Obviously, he does this in a lecture at the start of the episode, and I do appreciate that frequently in the show what they'll do is kind of to give us an update on where everybody's thoughts are regarding the murders and kind of bring us back up to date, kind of as a recap of things. Will give a lecture on it. And then usually that lecture is interrupted by one of the other characters and we begin our actual episode. But I do appreciate how they kind of use the lectures as a plot device to bring us up to speed in a way that doesn't feel useless, redundant, boring, etc. Obviously, we, for the first time, kind of get to follow Hannibal on a hunt, kind of like in the past. We've had it hinted at that it was, a killer. He might have said, "Oh, the rabbit ran fast," and then you get a like little flash to a man running. But this is like kind of the first time where we see not only how he chooses his victims, but also how he hunts them. So we basically get to see him choosing the recipes. Then he goes to his little place where he keeps his business cards. He gets business cards from people who are rude to him. In the case of this episode, the first one that like the one that we actually get to follow the hunt for was basically like somebody who was drawing blood for insurance purposes back when he was a surgeon who was very rude to him while asking if he has any diseases as that could impact his insurance amount. So he first chooses the recipe, then he pulls out the business card, then we see him basically interfering with the person's car, and then he drives up when he's in trouble, asking him if he needs help, and then basically attacking him. And then we then see him basically in the morgue in two pieces and are told that he was found on a bus sitting across the aisle from himself. I do want to note that the imagery of him sitting across himself on a bus, when it was shown on screen, wasn't that great. Like, one of the things I love about the series the most is the imagery. That wasn't it. At least that part of the episode, it flopped a bit. We then also see in kind of a montage where we see him going through even more recipes that involve organs, and then we see him picking out business cards, and then we see basically all of the lab characters, Beverly, Brian, Jimmy, Jack, and Will, all in the morgue as there are multiple bodies lined up, some of which are Hannibal's work and some of which are the subplot for this episode's organ harvester's work. Where we do get the good imagery, though, as I mentioned, because this show is all about the imagery, at least in my opinion, where we do get to see some of the good imagery in this episode, there's a scene where Jack, who obviously is still having a hard time emotionally coping with the potential of Miriam being alive and abandoned, and just Miriam's arms surfacing in general, he's been having nightmares, and one of them we see that he walks into the morgue and we find that Will sits up and Will is obviously dead. He has the scars from the autopsy with the stitches and is missing an arm, like Miriam is missing an arm, basically conflating his previous protege with his current one, Will, who he is using to try to catch the Ripper. It is even noted by Alana that Jack is trying to groom Will to catch the Ripper and that Jack is obsessed with the Ripper. We also get Franklin again, which we have been introduced to in the past, but we haven't seen him in a while, and now he's back, and we're seeing that he is such a pitiful character, but he is a bit of a stalker and obsessive about the people he wants to be friends with. It's even noted that Hannibal notes how Tobias is his best friend, but he isn't Tobias's bestie. And obviously, he's like a very pitiful character. He's trying so hard to like the things his friends like so that they will like him. He's just sad. And I wanted to call that out because I feel like there's a lot of people who are people pleasers who try to fit into a mold that they just don't fit in. And that never works out. You always have to be yourself. And then we, of course, get Will's first time missing an appointment with Hannibal. Now, as you've probably heard me say before, I feel like this show really, the reason I watch it personally, there are other interesting characters. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of other interesting characters. But for me, it's all about Will and Hannibal. Like, if none of the other characters existed, I wouldn't be sad about it. I like Hannibal and I like Will, and I think that they are the main characters, and they are the ones the story revolves around, in my opinion. And I love that Will misses his appointment, and Hannibal opens the door, seemingly like he looks excited. Then he sees the empty waiting room. He looks crestfallen. He goes to his desk. He fidgets around. He doesn't know what to do with himself because Will has abandoned him. He opens up his appointment book. We see that Will was supposed to be there. It is clearly in his appointment book that Will should be there, and he isn't. And here's the funniest thing, at least to me, how fidgety and just like he doesn't know what to do with himself because Will has abandoned him for the first time. And then he goes to find Will. And Will, that is when he walks in on Will, who's basically staring off into space. And this is where we get our second actual good imagery for this episode, which is where Will is basically in his hallucination. He's essentially sitting across from Abigail. And basically, in place of a table between them is Cassie Boyle's um, mounted body, the stag head one, which is one of the most iconic imageries of the show, as the table between them. And then Abigail makes a comment that they're not alone, and that is when he kind of comes out of his hallucination, fugue state, whatever you'd like to call it, to Hannibal arriving and learns that it's 9 o'clock and thinks he fell asleep, and asks Hannibal if he was sleepwalking, and Hannibal comments that, his eyes were open, but no one was home. Then, of course, that's when they find, like when Beverly and Jack put together the pieces to find the ambulance user. And of course, because they're already together, Hannibal tags along, which happens to be convenient because then he's able to help the last victim of the harvester, which he does end up saving his life. But that, of course, is once again where you see Hannibal and Will at the crime scene together. Hannibal's called over. Will watches him save the guy's life. There's a look on his face. I don't know if it's him having like an epiphany of, ooh, this could be the Ripper, or just like is impressed with Hannibal. I honestly am not great at reading faces. So there's some emotion there. I'm not sure what it was, but we had that. And then, of course, later he's invited to the dinner party, but he just leaves the wine. They have a fun conversation. He makes Will laugh. They have their little friendly banter back and forth. And as compared to the last episode, I do like that there was a lot more interaction between Will and Hannibal. And then, of course, there was the introduction of Bedelia, who is a character that I personally enjoy as a character. Like, I think if I could be a character, I'd probably want to be her. She's like got that whole, I don't know, it's a very powerful feminine character, is what she comes off as. And it's one of my favorite characters in the show. So I'm glad that she was introduced here. But having said all that, positives, negatives all considered, I didn't like it as much as the last episode, but I did like it quite a bit. And I put it at a 7 out of 10 overall for my personal ranking. And then as a reminder of the rankings so far, in the first place, we had the last episode, Entree. Second place was Amuse-Bouche. Third place, Sorbet. Fourth, Aperitif. Fifth, Souffle. Sixth, Coquelle. And then seventh is Potage. And then to close off the episode, we'll update our series ranking so far. In the series ranking, it's where we're going to compare all of the seasons against each other, like rank the seasons against each other. Obviously, we won't have a final ranking of that until we finish the series completely, but we are going to update the scores. So, a reminder, there are 13 episodes within the season. That means a total maximum score that can be achieved is 130 points. By adding the objective 10 points from this episode, our mostly objective ranking is 57 out of 130. And on the personal side, we've ranked it 7, and that brings that total score up to 41 out of 130. Once we finish the season, we'll find out the total percentage score for that season, and then as each season is completed, we'll get the percentages of those, and in the end find out which seasons were the best overall and which ones weren't. So with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Hannibal Season 1, Episode 7, Sorbet. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.